So, hey guys, welcome to the channel, and today we'll be talking about the topic which is version control. So, I hope everybody who is watching this video right now have some or little knowledge of version control, what is it, and how it works, where it is used. Okay, but we'll start from the basics, like what is version control. So, as the name suggests, right? So version control is controlling a version, okay, to maintaining a version, so like that. So how does it work? I mean, what version control do? Why is it developed in the first place? Okay, so we'll be covering this version control, what version control is, then what is the features of this version control, then what are the version control tools available in the market, and what are the different kinds of version control system. So let's get started with the version control first. So as I said, version control is something, is a technology basically which allows users to control the versions of your piece of work. Okay, so I'm saying piece of work because it can be anything. It can be a code, it can be a text file, it can be an image, it can be a logo, or if it's a there's a content writer, it can be an article which they are working on, or it can be image. Suppose a graphic designer is working on something, some project, so they would have their set of images which they create. So it can be anything which needs a version, which needs a snapshotting. So by snapshotting I means a different types of version of the same piece of work which they are doing. So this technology, this version control, helps users, developers, content writers, or anybody who have large file systems they are dealing with every day, in their daily basis in their projects. So they help these users in the project to maintain different versions of the project or the application, okay, as the time progress. So for a long term project, if you see, so if there is a deadline of like 1 year or 2 year project, then there would be a significant amount of evolution on the applications, right, on which the developers are working on. So they need to have a different versions of the applications available, so that in future if they want to exclude some kind of some module or some functionality, they can again go back to the previous version, and they can they can push it to the production if they don't want that particular functionality. Okay, so this is basically a version control. Okay, so by understanding the concept of version control, we may think like it's just for controlling or just maintaining different kinds of version, but no, there are lot many feature which is more useful than this version, than we talked about of having different sets of version, which are, first is collaboration. Okay, so nowadays in every project across IT industry, we are working as a team, right? At the end of the day, we have different team members, right? So and each team member is having different capability, different skill set. They are working on different kind of modules in the projects. A project can have different modules based on different skill set, and not every developer is having the same skill set to work on different modules. Okay, so each developer is working on a different module or different application or different set of tasks to complete, to aid to that application. In that scenario, version control helps them or gives them uh, um, a helping hand in collaborating with each other. Okay, so we'll get into that in the deep. So first let's understand what is in the screen right now. So I have segregated two scenarios. So the first scenario on the left hand side is having a development system, or having a scenario where we don't have any version control system. Okay, in the right hand side we have a scenario, a team where we have version control system applied. So let's see first this with the version control system where we don't have any version control system. Okay, so let's say we have three developers, A, B, and C, and those are working on module 1, module 2, and module 3 respectively of a particular application. So as per this diagram, what is happening, so each developer is working on a particular module, and the other developer is unaware about the changes which they are doing in their module. So in this diagram, the developer B and developer C is not aware about the changes what developer A has done in the module 1. Okay, until and unless this all different piece of codes merges together and bring out into an application. Okay, and in this scenario what happens is, suppose right now all of the three developers are working at three different modules, so there might not be any sudden, I mean, any conflicts because they are working on different module. But there can be a scenario where two or more than two developers are working on the same module of that application but in their different system. Okay, then in that case what will happen when they merge their code or when they mix their code to bring out an application, lots of conflict will arise because they don't have the update what other developer had changed. Okay, so this is the demerit of not having a version control system. Okay, so the task become very tedious the when the small chunks of model which has been developed and they need to be merged together, then the tasks become very tedious because there would definitely be a lots of conflicts. Okay, and to resolve that it will like eat up all the developers head. So let's go with the version control system. So as you can see in this diagram, I have represented developer A, B, and C as like they are working on a same project. Okay, so there is a project which is at a centralized place somewhere, which has all the modules in place, and each of the developers are accessing that particular centralized source of code, and kind of they are cloning it or they are taking a local copy of that particular repository in their system and they are working on their module what they have been assigned on. Similarly, B is working and C is working at the same time parallelly on the same set of code base, right? So it might happen at the end of the day they might have changed something and they might have different versions of it, but at the end of the day it will merge into a single code. It will go into the same centralized repository so that next day when developer comes they can take an update of the centralized repository and they can start working on whatever they have left upon or whatever they have finished last day. Okay, so this is version control. So what happens when version control provides a collaborative environment? So it helps developers or users in like to help them work independently with independently like in the system with a local copy of the main source codes, and at the same time they are updated with the changes which are happening around the project. Okay, so developer B is changing something, so that will be reflected when developer B will push their changes to the main source code. Okay, main storage place where all the source code are there already. So when B pushes their changes, A can get an update from that particular place and he can continue his work on that particular module. So in that way version control helps in collaboration. Okay, so this is one of the biggest feature of version control is collaborative environment. Okay, now I'll go to the features of version control. So first we have already talked about, which is collaboration. The second is storing versions, which we talked about a little, like having a different set of versions of your piece of work which you are doing. So let's say, let's take an example of a graphic designer. Okay, so suppose he's working on a logo, to design a logo for a particular company. Okay, then he has a prototype design ki what the logo will look like at the end. Okay, but he still have a long journey to go. He has to start from the scratch and he needs to deliver a full-fledged logo, right? So it will take time. It will go through a process. He will create different sets of he will try different sets of logos, different sets of designs, and he might want to keep different versions in the system so that he can reuse that particular design if it isn't like any other design. So in that case version control gives the feature of having different versions. So he can, instead of storing it in his local system, he can store it at a centralized space where he can have the version and he don't have to like explicitly mention like this logo is version 1, this logo is version 2. Okay, there can be a single logo file with the different versions, so that feature is allowed by version control. The third is backup. So what do we mean by backup here is see, in version control enabled environment, all the developers are working on local copy of the same set of code, right? So what happens, suppose in disaster scenario, suppose the centralized repository is not accessible, okay, is lost, or we have lost all the data from the centralized repository, but still, since the developers, the team is working on that set of code, they have the updated versions of that code already in their system. So in that case, it helps in providing the backup, because in future we can use that particular set of code and make it as a centralized repository, and we can continue developing the project further with this version control system. Okay. Now, going forward, uh, since version control is very famous, so it might be having various, there might be having various version control system tools, right? So there are lots of version control system tools, and I have just picked up four because this is the most common one, which was being used and which is being used right now. So I have divided into two system. The first, left hand side, I have kept Git and Mercurial. Right hand side, I have kept Subversion and CVS. So before going into this different kind of different types of version control tools, first we need to understand is what are different types of version control system. Okay, so these are the tools, right, which uses version control system internally. But what are different type of version control system? So basically there are two kind of version control system which we are talking about here. The first one is centralized version control, which is old now because the latest one is distributed version control. So first we will see the centralized version control. So as the name suggests, centralized version control. Okay, so this centralized indicates that the particular project or particular set of code is placed at a centralized server somewhere, some storage location. Okay, and it allows version control capabilities to the users or the developers, but this works on a client server model. So what is client server model? In CVC, let's say I'm saying the centralized version control as the CVC. So in CVC, what happens is there is a master copy of code in some remote server, okay, and a particular developer, there are two developers, okay, developer A and developer B, and both of them have to work on that particular remote repository, because to get a local copy, to get a copy of that, basically copy of that code, and he can work on it. So what happens in CVC system is, suppose developer A is working on some piece of code, okay, so what CVC allows the developer A to work on that particular piece of code, and it will lock that particular piece of code for the time until and unless developer A has completed working on that and he has checked out the code back to the centralized server. So suppose in the meanwhile developer A is working on some piece of code and developer B also wants to access the same piece of code in CVC system, he will not be allowed, because that particular piece of code is locked by developer A, has been checked in by developer A, so that is not available for any other team members or any other developer to access that particular piece of code until unless developer A checks out sorry checks I mean complete his work and checks out of that particular remote repository. That piece of code is cannot be available to any other developer. So this is the biggest demerit of centralized version control, because in that, at a time, only one developer can work on that particular piece of code. But if we see distributed version control, so as the name suggests, distributed, so it means the centralized code, there is a code which is in a centralized repository, it is placed at a server which is centralized, okay, and the distributed means key, it is distributed among the developers at the same time. The same piece of code or the same whole project, the local copy of the whole project is distributed among each and every developers, and each and every developers can work on any piece of code irrespective of what other developers are working on, because each developer is working on their own local copy. Okay, they are not directly working on the centralized repository. They have they have checked out that particular repository and they have cloned it into their system. They have the local copy of the whole project and they are working on that particular local copy. So in that case, developer A, B, C, n number of developers can work on the same piece of code at the same time without affecting each other. Okay, so that is the biggest advantage of distributed version control. Okay, So the two which I have listed on here is Git and Mercurial, and both of them are used. But as far as I understand, or I have, because I have used only Git in my software development career till now, so I don't know much about Mercurial because I've not used that. But both of them are distributed version control and widely used as Git only. If you see centralized version control, so I mentioned two, which is Subversion and CVS. So we might have seen SVN Tortoise in, if anybody can recall, in their previous projects or like 1 or 2 year back, there was something called SVN Tortoise where the same thing was the same thing used to happen. There was a center there used to have a centralized repository, and you need to check in the code from there or check out the code from there. Maybe I am just not using the right check in and check out here because I don't know about centralized version control much. But let's take an example like the developer A have wants to work on that particular piece of code, and in that tortoise has been, okay, so he has locked that particular piece of code and the other developer cannot access. So that was a demerit. So obviously that has been overcome by this distributed version control, and this is the biggest reason why it is being used widely across the industries. So now we have looked upon what is version control, what are its features, and what are different kind of tools available in the market to use version control in your application or your project, whatever you're working on. So now let's go to distributed version control system, because this whole series will be targeted to Git and the remote repositories using Git, which uses Git. So we'll be talking more about distributed version control system. We'll not be talking about central version control system in detail. So the next topic we're gonna discuss right now is distributed version control system. So as I said right now in previous section, that there is a centralized repository where all our project codes are available, right? Updated codes are available, and sorry, and we have different users, different developers, which have their own local copy in their system, and they work parallelly in that particular local copy of that particular project, and which will not affect others. Because if you see this diagram clearly, at top there is a server which is centralized repository, we can say, where all the updated code of the project is hosted. And if you go left hand side, this repository is the local repository of the main centralized repository, and it is available in developer A's system. Similarly, the middle repository is the local repository for developer B, okay. And similarly, the last repository, the right hand side repository in the middle one, is for developer C. So each of the developer is working on a local copy of the same centralized repository, same centralized source of code. And what they do, we basically is, suppose let's take an example of developer A here. So suppose he has started his day in the morning in the office, and he came to the office, then he needs to work on a particular module. So the first thing what he'll do is he'll try to check whether that centralized repository is having any update, or is having any modification in the code which he does not have, because he had a local copy which was of the last day. So first thing he'll do is he'll pull an update, he'll pull or he'll fetch the repository, centralized repository source set of projects into his local system. And then what will happen is the whatever changes which has been done by other developers the previous day, that all will be available in his local system, local copy. Now he can start working on a different module, or whatever module he wants to work on. So now he's completely sure that his local copy and the centralized repositories copy is actually same. There is no modification, there is no nothing out of sync. Both of these, local copy and the centralized copy, is sync, which eventually get out of sync as he progresses the day, and as he do the changes in his local repository. But at the end of the day, he would be pushing back the changes to the centralized repository, okay. So this is the whole scenario how it works. So there is a centralized repository, you fetch it into your system, make it a local repository, you work on that particular local repository, do the changes you wanted to do, test all the functionality. Once you are complete doing your changes, you push back your changes from your local repository to your remote repository, and you are done. Okay, similarly the same thing can be done by developer B, developer C, and they can do it parallelly. They are doing it parallelly actually. So that any changes or any modification of developer A is not affecting developer B, because all of them are working on their each local copies. Okay, so this is how distributed version control system works. So in our series we'll be going with the Git as a version control system, and in the next video I'll be starting what is Git, what are Git features, okay, and what are the basic commands of Git. So in the next video I'll not straight away start with Git. I want to give you an idea of like how Git works and how some of the basic commands of Gits, and then the next video we'll try with the concept of Gits and the feature of Gits, and then installing Git and all those things. Okay, so stay tuned. Bye bye.